Hello everyone and welcome to the recap show of the Saint Louis Rapid Blitz. My name is Tatev Abrahamyan and I'm going to take you to the highlights of day 1. Saint Louis Rapid Blitz is going to take place over the next 5 days. 3 days of Rapid and 2 days of Blitz. So 9 games of Rapid and 18 games of Blitz. You can see the 10 participants below, which includes the 2-time winner of the tournament, Levon Aronian, Hikaru Nakamura, previous winner, and the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So the Saint Louis Rapid Blitz used to be part of the Grandmaster, but because the Grandmaster was cancelled this year, it's a standalone tournament and it's taking place online. So today the first day of the Rapid happened, so 3 rounds of Rapid were played, and I'm going to take you through the highlights of each round. So let's start with the key matchup of the round, which is Hikaru Nakamura versus Magnus Carlsen. So if you've been following chess during the summer, you know that these two players have a pretty big rivalry going on. They played an epic match in the Magnus Carlsen Invitational Finals, which came down to the wire, which was decided in Armageddon. They also just recently tied for first place in the Chess 9LX tournament, which was a official random tournament. So once again, they meet, and this time in the first round of the tournament. So Magnus Carlsen chose the Caro-Kann defense, and the position gets quite complicated. So here he chose to play c5. And this is where things get quite complex, as Hikaru decides to sacrifice a pawn. So he takes, runs back, and he does not take back on c4, instead he goes b4. And right away after sacrificing a pawn, he does not choose the right continuation. Instead of taking on e7 and playing knight g5, which he should have done, forcing g6 to the mate on h7 and something like knight g3. And threatening taking on h5 and knight f6 and attacking the king. Instead, he started with knight g3, and after taking, and now we see this poor pawn structure, and the pawn on a5 being isolated. So g6, and now it turns out that white doesn't have as many attacking pieces. So knight goes to d5. Pawn c3, and black has consolidated and he's up a healthy pawn, and the pawn on c3 is a very dangerous passed pawn. So things go from bad to worse for Hikaru as the pawn reaches c2, and there's going to be a really nice tactic right here. Black takes on g3, and take back as a problem because of queen a3, winning the rook immediately. And rook c7, and now finishing the game off with a very strong queen g5. A pretty basic tactic for a world champion, but nonetheless a really nice way of finishing the game. So a nice win for the world champion, starting the tournament off with a victory with the black pieces. So let's move on to our next game, which is the game between Wesley So and Jeffrey Zhang, the two Americans. Wesley So is a former US champion and former winner of the Grandmaster, and Jeffrey Zhang is 19-year-old, 2700 rated Grandmaster from the US, a very strong player. And I really like this game is because I think it's really instructive, and I'm going to show you this endgame that was won by Wesley. So let's start in some kind of position, and then I'll take you through the game to the key moment, which I think is a key moment. So as we can see, Wesley is up a pawn, and he starts bringing his king. So Jeffrey decides to give up another pawn, hoping to get the pawn on f6 and to make some kind of a draw. Or maybe thinking that he has a fortress of some sort here. So cutting the king off, except this is quite temporary, as the king is going to run. And we reach this kind of an endgame, which I think happens quite a bit, where one side is trying to run. As we see, white is going to try to run here and win the rook, and black is going to try to take the pawn on h3 and queen their pawn, so it's going to be a race. And spoiler alert, white did win this game, as you can see, and it was just by a tempo, which I think why it's so instructive. So let's take a look. So the game follows a very logical path. So winning the rook. Checking the king and making sure the pawn on h3 survives. And now rook f3, and now as black queens. Now a key move in the game, king f3. The problem is you would love to be able to play king e2 and make a draw. But the king f3 is a very nice, very instructive move because you're going to take the pawn on h4, but you're not just going to the pawn directly, you're also shouldering the black king and stopping the king from getting to f4 and making a draw. So I think this kind of endgames are quite instructive because it looks like it doesn't matter what white plays because you're getting the h4 pawn, it doesn't matter which route you go, but something like this would actually end up in a draw. So those puzzles that we solve in books, they actually come in handy and can happen in our games. So I thought this was a very instructive moment. Let's take a look at our next game of the round, which was Lenier Dominguez versus Pentala Harikrishna. Pentala Harikrishna has played several times in St. Louis, but never in this tournament, and he's actually making waves as he's had a phenomenal day today. So let's start in this position. So the position was close for a very long time, and it still is, not a lot of pawn exchanges. So bishop d3 was played, white takes, and now black takes the pawn with a check, and I think maybe Dominguez hallucinated for a second and forgot about an option that black had. Of course he has to play king here and exchange on d3. Instead he goes queen d2, and the difference is in the other position he is down a tempo because now black plays the very strong move g5, breaking apart the pawn structure, and now we're going to see how all of white's pawns fall apart. And just taking every single pawn. So Lenier Dominguez had to resign because he's just going to lose all the pawns and thus the game. And our final game of the round we're going to look at is between Alareza Firouzja and Levon Aronian. I'm sure Alareza Firouzja is a name all of you have heard by now. He is quite popular. He's made waves when he finished second in the World Rapid Championship last year. And he's a very strong player and very exciting player. So this game I think you're going to enjoy a lot. So we have Firouzja with white, Aronian with black. And the sequence is really amazing, so let's take a look. So white goes d5, attacking the queen, while his own queen is under attack. So takes on e3, takes on a3. So now taking on e6. So we have to trade rooks, of course. So now the knight takes. So there's a lot of intermediate moves. So we cannot move the bishop because take on queen. So takes the rook, and again, we don't want to take this because our knight is hanging. So another intermediate move. And again, we're not taking back on c6, we're taking on b2. And we're not taking back on c6 again, giving up this pawn. Instead, c3. So a lot of adventures happen in this game. I will just play through it fast just to show you how it ended, which was quite heartbreaking for the youngster. He just recently played in the Chess 9LX tournament and he suffered there quite a bit. But he still was really grateful about his opportunity to play the top players. And this game, I just want to show you the final position, which was quite heartbreaking for the young player. So we reached this position, so it's becoming a pawn race. And maybe this is another hallucination, like we already saw one in a previous game. And knight d7, as opposed to letting the queen, the pawn queen with a check. And the difference is now the black pawn is going to queen with a check, ending the game. So a really heartbreaking way of losing for young Alareza. But it is a quick game, and this was already in time scramble, so things like this do happen even at the highest level. And the game between Alexander Grischuk and Jan Nepomniachtchi ended in a draw. So let's move on to the next round. So next round only saw two decisive results, and one of them was quite heartbreaking. So in this game between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi, I'll just go to the final position. So let's take a look in this position. So if we look here, It says 0-1, so it's kind of mysterious, and the commentators were also surprised because they thought maybe it's a glitch, or the server didn't record the score correctly or something. And then we later found out that he actually flagged. So Magnus Carlsen, he disconnected for I don't know, he had 35 seconds, so he disconnected. He could not connect on time, and he lost the game, which is one of the pitfalls of playing online. But this is the option we have right now. So it was really unfortunate, and it's very difficult to see things like this because I don't think anyone enjoys seeing the top players lose like this. And I'm sure the player himself, he was very disappointed, and because at this point the game was quite crazy, but at this point the dust had settled, and just to lose like this, it's kind of like a pointless way of losing the game. So this was how this game ended, and the other game was between Levon Aronian and Alexander Grischuk, and that game was absolutely crazy. I will take you to the key moment. So this looks like some kind of a banco or maybe some Benoni, something kind of crazy, but it was actually an F3 Nimzo. So Queen H4 was played, and not a lot of good moves here for white, so he decides to run away because he cannot go Queen F2. And G3 runs into some unpleasantness here. So he decides to go King D1. Offers Queen exchange, of course not going to trade. King H8, threatening F5, not a very mysterious move, trying to open the position blast open. So going for it, and Grischuk was playing an amazing game until I will show you the key moment where he blundered. So he takes the pawn, another intermezzo we see. And here he took on d4. He actually has an amazing move going c4 and asking what this rook is going to do with itself. And rook e1 runs into simple rook e1, cannot take because of the skewer. And cannot take with the queen because of the double attack. And now everyone's hanging, and this king is not going to survive for too long. Instead he took on d4, which is very understandable. Rook a8, cannot touch the rook because the queen will go on e2. But unfortunately rook a8 was a mistake because queen f2. And this is a very difficult move to face because it feels like black has to opt out for the endgame because now your rook is hanging and the queen is hanging. You still had the chance of playing queen g6 and eyeing this square because this doesn't work out quite well. And now we can try rook e2, we can take, and this is not going to be very pleasant. Instead, in the position he traded queens, and he went for this endgame. So I'll kind of fast forward it because this position was played for a very long time, so it was supposed to be a draw. It was very close to a draw, except we reached this position. So when we look at this position, whenever you have a corner pawn, you have to look at your bishop. So of course white is up a pawn, white is playing for a win, but all black has to do is give up this bishop for the pawn and just run to the corner. So black has to play h4 and stay in the square of this pawn, so at the opportune time he can run to h8 to the corner and not allow this bishop in any way to get traded. Instead, he made the big mistake of playing bishop c6, which again feels like a natural move, except after king c5. h4, now fixing the pawn on h5. Now there's target in a position, and now this bishop is going to get harassed. This dark square bishop. So the king runs to the pawn. So we're chasing the bishop away, so the bishop has to stay on the diagonal, otherwise the pawn's gonna start rolling. So now we trade pawns, and now we reach this position, and now I'm going to take it through the rest of this game and show you how this is just a winning endgame. The king is so far away and the bishop is going to end up on the wrong diagonal, which is a short diagonal. So pushing the pawn more. The bishop has to go there, because if you go here you get kicked off the diagonal. But now king c7 and bishop b5. And I do feel like this was a heartbreaking loss for Alexander Grischuk because he had a great position, he had a great attack, he was so close, and he just, queen f2, and he kind of fell apart a little bit and just everything went downhill. This game should have ended in a draw at some point, but just things, you know, when it rains it pours, so just things just keep getting worse and worse, and he had to resign in this position. The rest of the games ended in a draw. There were pretty quiet games. Hare Krishna versus Furoa, Jeffrey Zhang versus Lenier Dominguez, and Hikaru Nakamura versus Wesley So. So let's move on to round 3, because we had a very exciting round there. So let's get started with the game between Alexander Grishuk and Pentala Hare Krishna. So Pentala Hare Krishna, actually, after winning this game, he is one of the co-leaders. So we saw that Levon Aronian won 2 games in a row, and Pentala Hare Krishna actually managed to keep pace with him. So let's jump to move 36, and clearly Alexander Grishuk did not have a good day today. So this position, if you look at it, is quite crazy. This bishop is obviously a gunner, but there's a pawn on a6, which is very difficult to stop. So he made the big mistake of playing rook e7, which is such a natural move to get the rook out of the way, make a7 the next move, push the pawn, create some counterplay. Instead, he should have done king f1. So this is it's a computer analysis, which is very hard to find, very hard to make a lot of sense out of unless you see it. Unless once you see the computer analysis, you can make sense out of it, but finding it yourself, I think, is very difficult. And the point being, now this pawn is becoming unstoppable, and like if you continue engine's suggestion, this is what the engine suggests, just to repeat the position, make a draw again. Very hard to find, very hard to do, because, for example, if we go a7 instead, if I just follow, let's make some logical moves. So we can take, or we can take on c6. So instead we should repeat again. With no time on the clock and this complicated position, who's going to find things like this? Instead rook e7 was played. But now takes, and now there are some checkmating threats, and unfortunately this knight is overworked because defending the rook, defending the pawn, now the rook is awkwardly placed, so now there's a lot of miscoordination. And there comes checkmate. Hard to blame him for missing this checkmate. There wasn't really much to do in the position. The position was already very tough. And a nice win for Pentala Hare Krishna, who scored 2.5 points out of 3 and was joined by Levon Aronian, who drew his game. So let's take a look at our leader's game. He was playing Yan Nipponichi. It was a very complicated game, was a very crazy game. So at some point, I feel like Levon started losing the thread of the game, and he decided, no more of this. I'm going to build some kind of a fortress, which is what he said in the post-game interview. So in this position, he takes on b3. And puts a pawn on a5 and a bishop on g5. So the game continues. He actually gives up this pawn at some point and start taking other pawns. And this game just ends in a draw because opposite color bishops, and there's just no way to make progress. There's just no way to do anything, because if you lose, push this pawn, there's not even too much that white has needs to do here to make a draw. We can put a bishop on c4 and a king on c2, for example, if we make moves. Something like this, and we can just wait. And just a fortress. So the game ended in a draw. So now Hare Krishna and Levon Aronian are tied for first place. So let's take a look at some other exciting games. This was somewhat of a quiet round. There were a lot of draws. So there was only this one decisive result. There could have been another one between Dominguez and Hikaru Nakamura. Unfortunately, Lenier Dominguez blundered and in a winning position, which I'm sure was a huge disappointment for him. So let's start in this position. Hikaru just played a5, and another thing we see in textbooks that happened in the game. take on b6. So we cannot go b7 yet because of the fork. So the king comes back to stop the pawns. Takes another pawn. Now there's too many passed pawns for black to deal with. So he makes the mistake of putting his king on c3, putting himself in this fork. Instead he should have gone to b1. And now he really needs to push this pawn because this knight is untouchable. The pawn will just run. Instead, knight d3 is just a blunder and losing this key pawn. And now the king is way too close to all these pawns. And let's take a look how all of these pawns just drop. And giving up the knight and just forcing a draw. So could have been a really nice victory for Leonid Dominguez. Unfortunately, it ended in a draw. And another exciting game we had was between the two teenagers, Alareza Firouzja and Jeffrey Zhang. So this game was something. It was a lot of complications. So let's jump to the key moment in the game, which is on move 28. So Jeffrey Zhang plays knight f6 and Firouzja decides to take here, knight e5, and he doesn't do anything about his queen, he simply takes on d8. And we reach this position, which looks... okay, let's make another move. And we reach this position, which looks pretty bad for black, because it looks like this knight is not going to survive here, because the queen is just so disconnected, the square is not available. So here, Alareza decides to play rook d7, but it looks like after rook d8, something like this looks quite dangerous. This knight is getting stuck and you can just start taking pawns. And you have to go g5, of course, because g6 is not possible and the threat is to come and take. So rook d7 was played, f4, looking for some counterplay whenever there's a queen. We're looking at a weak king. Cannot take back this way. There's queen g4. So rook goes to f7, threatening mate. Queen blocks. Cannot take on c4, there is still mate. Knight f6, great move. Solves the problem of the knight and of the weak king. So e4, and Alareza decides it's time to go for a draw. And the two teenagers threw their game, which was a very exciting game, and you know, a lot of complications, a lot of things to analyze if you want to take a closer look at it. The other game that was left is between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen. Wesley So with the white pieces was too solid, and the game was pretty even throughout, and the world champion was not able to bounce back from his disappointment in the previous round. So these are just the highlights. If you guys want to take a closer look, you can take a look at the games on uschesschamps.com. You can analyze the games yourself, what I would encourage you to do. And make sure you're tuning in tomorrow for day 2 of 3 more exciting rapid games of the Saint Louis Rapid Blitz. You can check it out on US Chess Champs or on Saint Louis YouTube channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in.